Thanks for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department. We have been moving sequentially, so we started with the DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions. So if you have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. And we want to say a thank you to all of our sponsors. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what PTACs can offer. Set Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities, alerts, assure you won't miss important sources, sought, and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. Please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. Please contact Alicia Field with the email shown on the screen if you have any questions. C3 Integrated Solutions, a full-service IT provider that specializes in securing our nation's defense industrial base through cloud-based solutions and industry-leading partners. For more than 13 years, C3 has provided boutique tech services, including managed services, security, and Microsoft 365 integration services. C3 specializes in Microsoft Government Cloud Solutions, and including GCC, GCC High, and Azure Gov, helping clients achieve CMMC, DFARS, and NIST 800-171 compliance. C3 offers an award-winning tailored approach to each client regardless of size and across a variety of industries. WorkPlan is the only ERP system built for government contractors that's both easy to use and robust. WorkPlan is affordable and scalable to contractors of all sizes. The system includes everything needed for DCAA compliant accounting, time and expense, incurred cost submission, project budgeting, and forecasting, and more. To see how WorkPlan can work for you, visit the links provided. And now for a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information can be found on our website. We have launched another webinar series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month that take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen and then take your live questions about that topic. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. You can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each webinar. Next month, we will be covering set-asides with Anna, Eric, Sai, and Tim. In November, we get into pricing with Michael, Marcia, Tracy, and Jeff. And lastly, in December, our speakers Shirley, Joshua, Kate, and Brad will present on M&A. Discount code is again DFARS to save $15 and bring your costs down to $20. I wanted to highlight an additional webinar we are holding this year. The title of this webinar is Fiscal New Year Kickoff Best Practices and will be this Friday, October 1st at 12 p.m. This webinar is sold out, however, the recording will be available within 24 hours on our website and YouTube channel. And now to introduce our speaker, Lewis Rhodes. Welcome, Lewis. We're so glad to have you here with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mandy. And they have a great group of sponsors here, but I'm going to give a special plug as a member of the Reston Chamber of Commerce and active with the GovCon committee. If you're out in this area, I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of great companies and a lot of great individuals with some cool events. So it's a good organization, and I recommend it as a good source of contacts and learning. And good afternoon, everyone. We're covering DFARS Part 243, which is contract modifications. Everybody's favorite part of contracting. Next slide, please. So as we're well into the DFARS at this point in time, I'm sure everyone's heard repeatedly about how the DFARS works in as a supplement with the FAR. And this is the DoD's individual aspects of how they can impact the FAR and how they are going to supplement the provisions of the FAR specific to DoD. Now, as DoD is one of the major stakeholders on the FAR Council, the DFARS tends to not deviate from the FAR very dramatically. And you're going to find that here as we cover Part 243. The important thing is you can never open the DFARS and read a section and feel like that's the standalone requirement. You got to look at the FAR. The DFAR is, if it's not covered in the DFARs, look in the FAR specifically. If they conflict, then the DFARS is likely going to control. But generally, you're going to see the FAR will have a baseline requirements, and then the DFARS will add to it. That's mostly what we're going to see here as we walk through section 243. So FAR Part 43 is the section that talks about contract mods under the FAR. There's the vast majority of modifications you're going to deal with are going to be under Part 43. As we get into this sections here on Part 243, you're going to see that it's fairly light. There's not a lot of content. There's a couple really important sections that I want to foot stop and point out. But overall, the 243 is fairly minimal. I would say probably 95% of your modifications are just going to be under FAR Part 43. And as we're all dealing with right now, what's happening with the COVID vaccine mandate, I'll address how the Part 43 modification process is going to come into play with that towards the end of this presentation. Yes, that's a spoiler alert. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I just said, DFARS Part 243 is limited. There's not a lot of provisions, and it doesn't go into detail about how mods are issued. You can basically organize this part into 3 sections. There's a section up front that covers some basic procedural issues. Then there's the most in-depth part of Part 243 goes into for on-price change orders. However, this only applies to on-price change orders over $5 million. So you're dealing with some pretty substantial size contracts if you're dealing with a change order that's over $5 million. So even though it's a fairly heavy and robust area of this part, chances are most contracts won't hit a $5 million change order unless you're building something very big. And then at the last part of the Part 243 is there's some contract clauses that are thrown in under DFARS here, and one's really important. We're going to talk about REAs. So if you got a DoD contract that's got the DFARS clause in it, there's a certification you need to add with an REA. That's probably the most important part of this section as we go through this part. Next slide, please. Okay, so the DFARS procedural items. The first section of DFARS, and again, is 243.10770. This is a notification of substantial impact on employment. This was actually implemented a few years ago as part of one of the National Defense Authorization Acts. The big picture here is Congress wants to hear if DoD is canceling some canceling some programs or cutting some funding or getting rid of a program of record, how is that going to impact the jobs in my district? Okay, so that, I mean, you can really kind of cut to the chase where a congressman wants to be. You know, if you're going to stop building a F-15 fighter jet, and you know you're going to close factories, and I'm going to lose a bunch of jobs for my constituents, I want to know that. Obviously, that's a really big contract, but these don't have to be that big. So this section of the DFARS implements clause 249.7003, and it relates to a termination or substantial reduction in a defense program. When that happens, primes have to notify its subcontractors of an anticipated termination due to a program of record change. All right, for all first-tier subcontractors with a value over $700,000 have to be notified under these procedures. It has to come from the contracting officer through the prime to the sub. But then it gets down to all lower tier subs with a contract of only $150,000. So you could be a lower tier sub with 2 or 3 people on contract, and you're going to fall under these provisions. Again, this is usually a major muscle movement by the DoD. This is, and it's not a contract ends or I'm going to change my work to a different type of program. This is, DoD is changing a program of record. They're cutting funding for this issue, and here's a bunch of people who are now going to be unemployed in this area. So this is kind of an important big picture item. It doesn't come up very often, but if you ever see a notification like this, it means, and you know, actually, as we're watching today with our politicians unable to pass a budget timely, and we're talking about sequestration again, there's another, you know, this is the kind of stuff that comes up when we have to close because of funding. So hopefully this doesn't come into play here in the next few days, but it very well might. But again, it's while it's focused on a big picture issue, $150,000 contract is not a big contract. So there's lots of subs out there who could be impacted down to this level. Next slide, please. Okay, the other parts of the procedural items, again, these tend to be very limited in focus and scope. There's 170, which is related to foreign military sales. 171 has to do obligation or deobligation of funds, and then 172 is the application of modifications. Now, if you go into the DFARS and go to any one of those sections, your sections are going to say specifically, and here's an example, under the obligation or deobligation of funds, the only thing the DFARS says is follow the procedures at PGI 243.171 when obligating or deobligating funds, period. That's the whole reg. And that leads you to question, like, what the heck is PGI? Well, PGI stands for Procedures, Guidance, and Information, and those are a sister supplement to the DFARS. PGI is a list of procedures and information that do not meet the criteria for inclusion into DFARS. Generally, this means it's guidance for the contracting officers. So if you get into, and if you go to the obligation or deobligation of funds and you say, oh, PGI 243.171, and you click on that and follow it through to to that section, you're going to see a series of instructions for a contracting officer on how they should handle the administrative side of obligating or deobligating funds. It absolutely has no impact on a contractor. It's all instructions for the government on how to handle it. Same thing with application for modifications. It tells the contracting officer the correct and proper order and procedure for issuing modifications, and what happens if you have to issue them out of order, et cetera, et cetera. So many of these sections of this DFARS that points to PGI, almost exclusively PGI is going to be a taskers and requirements for the contracting officer to handle. There's not going to be there's little to no impact on the contractor it's good information. You can go out there and review it, and if your modifications are out of order or something seems amiss, going through the PGI section is where you could figure out why the government's doing things the way they are. Next slide, please, Mandy. Okay, and the next big section, and this is probably where the bulk of Part 243 is, and it's applying the change orders. But again, it's not all change orders. And if you're a standard services contractor, small business with the DoD, you're never going to see a change order that falls under this part, as it applies to on-price change orders with an estimated value exceeding $5 million. So if you're getting a change order of 5 million, your contract is probably 10 times or bigger that. And again, this is also on price change orders. So they're going to relate to programs or construction and other issues where there's a lot of unknown variables. So you can't price out a change order. These change orders, when they're issued, they generally are going to have a they are required to have a not to exceed amount. And so the government is going to work with a contractor in these instances and say, okay, we're not sure what this change is going to cost, but we're going to give you an on-price change order modification max value of $8 million. And that's the extent of what you're authorized to spend under that modification. Now, the whole goal in this process, in this section, when you read through it, is you set up what's called a definitization process. Definitization is a word that contract attorneys know and not many other people. It's the process of how you're going to finalize and come to a definite contract terms. So if you have an on-price change order and you're not sure what it's going to cost, it's over $5 million. The government's asking you to, hey, you're supposed to build this small building, but we now want to build a big one behind it. Something, ridiculous example, but gets us in the scope. You're going to start building it and then say, okay, I have a max value of this. Well, you can operate under that change order for only a certain period of time before you have to come up with a more definite value. Under these DFAR provisions, you have 180 days under the on-price change order to come up with a price change order and definitize it, or 180 days or 50% of the not to exceed amount. So the government's protecting itself here. It's giving the contractor some leeway, understanding, the government doesn't know its requirements, or, there's a lot of things out there that are moving parts. So we're going to give you some opportunity to scope it a little bit better. We're going to give you a max value. But once you hit that 50% or 6 months, we need to come up with something a little more permanent. And that's really kind of the bulk of this 243-200 section. It all talks about that process. It's fairly straightforward. It's more of and again, when I get into regs and they get complicated and people are like, well, I don't understand what this means, I always advise clients to let's look at the whole overall purpose here. The purpose of this section is the government needs something. They don't know what they need, but they want to protect themselves from not being overcommitted and being taken to the cleaners. So they give the contractor a little bit of flexibility and leeway, and then they put some parameters around it in order to protect the taxpayer, basically. And if you go into this reg section, if it ever does apply to you, it's easier to read the flow and understand it when you keep that purpose in mind. And to give you an idea of where this comes in, right? There's exceptions to this part, these requirements. Initial parts. Obviously, you're buying a brand new program of record. I'm buying the new ACV for the Marine Corps, and I'm going to need a whole lot of parts to go with it. So you can add a bunch of parts for your initial part supply under here without this change. Ship construction, repair. Okay, if you think regular construction is bad, ship construction is way worse when it comes to comes to blowing budgets and schedules and everything else. You always find lots of things you're not prepared for. And then obviously the last one, contingency and humanitarian operations. Unless you've been living under a stone, everyone's been paying attention to the 100,000 Afghan evacuees who are here around the country. There's some here in our backyard in Quantico. A lot of that's all humanitarian operations with a lot of moving budgets, because when you start dropping in 10,000 people, you don't know what's gonna happen and what your requirements are gonna be. So generally, these change orders are rare. The exceptions to them are even more rare. So it's good to know that it's out there in case you're ever part of a team with a really big contract. But generally, you're not going to see, like I said, not only is it the $5 million issue, it's also the on-price change orders. Rarely are you going to see the government come to you and give you the keys to figure things out, unless you're in a pretty big or complicated program. Next slide, please. Okay, the last part on the change orders one is one I do want to point out to here, and this section comes up twice. We're going to talk about it here a little bit, and then it's going to come up under the contracts clauses part at the end of this DFARS. All right, so when you get into 243, 204, 71, it's broader than the $5 million on-price change orders, and applies to requests for equitable adjustment. All right, we all know and love REAs. Although I tend not to favor REAs because the government doesn't generally do much with them until you turn them into a claim. But if you're in a construction or other type industry, REAs are usually a little more standard. That said, no, this section applies to all REAs that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold. $250,000 is not a huge amount of money. So, this could be several DoD REAs. So you need to look through your DFARS sections of your contract and look to see if you've got, section 243, 204, tax 71 cited, or more importantly, look for clause 252, 243, 7002. All right, if that clause is in there, you have to submit an REA with a certification that's actually spelled out in the clause. It spells it out exactly what you need to say and how you need to say it. You need to certify when you submit an REA that the request is made in good faith. All right, good faith, I capitalize it here because that's a legal term of art when you start dealing with claims to the government. Right, because if your claim is not made in good faith, then the opposite of good faith is bad faith. And when you get in, if the government wants to accuse you of making a bad faith claim or any other bad faith approach to them, that's a very big problem. So when you submit an REA, now generally we all, if you've ever done an REA, when you enter in your claim under the REA, you generally throw in every conceivable dollar you possibly are entitled to. When you got to certify that in good faith, you might want to think a little bit twice along the fringes of what you put in an REA. REAs are submitted, they're generally negotiated, you reach a settlement number with the government if the government's going to cooperate under the REA, which is why you go in high and you ask, obviously you have to have a basis for asking for these costs. But when you have to sign a certification, you need to think twice around the fringes. Now, the other important thing on here is, and this is where this can get very confusing. When you submit an REA, you're like, oh, I submitted my claim. I'm good under the Contract Disputes Act. I'm fine with my time limit. No. An REA is not a claim with a capital C. It's a claim for money, but not a claim under the Contracts Disputes Act. Contracts Disputes Act has a certain requirements, and there's a very specific claim certification under the CDA that you have to come up with. So that claim certification is, again, that's driven by statute, not regulation. Contract Disputes Act is a law with implementing regulations. But so if you submit an REA and sign a certification, you may think that has you covered for a claim. It does not. The certification is different language. and it has some different, the language is different enough that the government will not consider an REA certification a certified claim. So that's just something to be really cognizant of. You have a lot of time to submit a claim. You have 6 years, but I've actually, one war story I can tell you is I took over a job as an in-house attorney for a company, and they had submitted a $36 million REA when you go back to shipbuilding, and they thought they were all covered under the REA, and they were negotiating with the Coast Guard. And when I came on board and I looked through the file, we had missed our window to file a claim. So that company had to eat and walk away from $36 million because it didn't follow the claim procedures, because it was confused between an REA and a claim. So that's a lot of money to leave on the table. So when you get into this part, I always tell people, you're welcome to do REAs on your own. But you should always consult a counsel, because if you miss these deadlines by a day, you're pretty much dead in the water. The government, the government's waivers of its immunity are very black and white, and if you don't meet them, you're going to be tossed out. So again, pay close attention to this DFARS clause. Your REA is not legitimate unless it's certified under this clause. Now, if it's smaller than 250,000, you're okay. But if it's over 250, you need to make sure you include this certification on the REA. But this REA certification is not a certified claim. That's a different process. So you can't rely on submitting your certified REA as a claim. Next slide, please, Mandy. Okay, so now that gets us into the contract clauses section, and there's three major sections of contract clauses added under DFARS 243. It's how you price contract modifications. Again, the REA one is set here as well, and then dealing with on price change orders. So these contract clauses, we've all seen them. When you look at the FAR, you see a list of things that start with 52. If it starts with a 52, we all know that means a FAR clause. FAR clauses become contract clauses, so they're either listed specifically in your contract, or they're cited in a table full of clauses. So you also get DFARS clauses, same thing. So when you get into if these specific DFARS sections apply to your contract, then these clauses need to be inserted. So the pricing contract modifications requires the insert of a clause about using contract cost principles. All right, this gets to your direct versus your indirect, what rates you can allow, and what's allowable and unallowable, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're pricing out contract modifications, it just implies all the other rules that are standard when you're pricing contracts to begin with. So nothing surprising in there. The REA one we already talked about. So this takes it outside of Part 204, 203.204, which was all the on-price change orders. They have it in here twice in DFARS because I guess they really wanted to foot stomp it. So if you again split that REA and it's over 250, make sure you go to that clause and the certification clause, and copy that certification as part of your REA. And then again, for the on-price change orders, there's two other clauses that are submitted. The one clause covers the definitization schedule, which spells out, how you're going to come up with the definitized value to that mod. And then, it cites back to the FAR, and we see a limitation on government liability. So if you have an on-price change order, you're going to have this FAR clause in it, and that FAR clause is going to have your ceiling amount. So we talked earlier about an on-price change order, anything above 5 million. All right, I think my max value is X. The government's going to give you a max ceiling value under that FAR clause, and it's going to say that they're not going to pay you. They're not going to pay you any more than that amount. So again, if you're part of a team that's dealing with some of these big change orders, make sure you're paying attention to these limitations in these clauses. Next slide, please, Mandy. All right, so that's it on DFARS. And like I said, the DFARS part 243 is fairly light. There's not a lot of specific parts in there, so no pun intended. So you're really going to generally be driven by FAR part 43. There was enough DFARS information in there that I thought it needed to be spoke about independently without tying into part 43. Because when you get into modifications under the FAR, that alone can take well over an hour to discuss. But the one section I do want to cover here, because you're all going to see this happening in the next 10 days, is how unilateral modifications work and how they tie to the COVID vaccine mandate. Okay, if you go back and you open FAR 43.103 and read section B, it talks about unilateral modifications. All right, everybody out here has gotten unilateral modifications. Oh, the government's adding this clause to my contract. The government's making this administrative change to my contract. All right, that's always done under a unilateral mod. The government sends it to you, they sign it. You don't have to sign it. You're considered bound by it under the regulations. All right, and then note where it says make changes authorized by a clause other than a changes clause. So if you have a new FAR clause that comes into being, and under that FAR clause is now the law of the land, the government will implement that FAR clause through a unilateral modification. Well, if you've been paying any attention to the COVID vaccine mandate, the executive order issued by President Biden on September 9th tasked the FAR Council with coming up with a new FAR clause to implement the guidance from the task force. Task force guidance came out on Friday. The FAR Council has until October 8th to implement a FAR clause that's going to implement or make the task force guidance required to contractors. Between October 8th and October 15th, you're going to see a whole bunch of unilateral mods implementing that new FAR clause to your existing contracts. Because right now the executive order says it's going to apply to new contracts, any new contracts issued after October 15th. What the government's going to do for existing contracts, vice new contracts, is going to give you a mod. So anyone who thinks they're going to, hey, my contract was just renewed, so this isn't going to impact me until I'm up for a renewal. I hate to spoil your opinion on that, but you're going to see this is going to apply to everybody, and this is how they're going to do it. Ties very well in with our modification section on DFARS, even though this is a FAR. So again, everybody look for sometime in about 10 days from now, you're going to be getting a mod to your contract, implementing that, adding that new FAR clause on the vaccines. So I've been kind of knee deep in the vaccine issue. I'm not going to cover it today. Obviously, it's not related, but my contact info is out there at the end. If anyone has any questions on whether your employees are covered or not. Spoiler alert, I will tell you that your employees are 99.9% likely to be covered. So, but this is, again, this is not DFARS, this is FAR, but it's relevant and kind of a hot topic. So if, but I believe this is our last slide, Mandy.
Yes, so
that's right.
Thank you so much.
There's my pretty picture and my contact info. Again, this was kind of a short topic, and but there were a couple key points that I wanted to make sure I stress. The one that's really important is the REA certification. So if you ignore everything else I said all day today, just understand and keep in the back of your mind, if you have a DoD contract and you're submitting an REA, oh wait, there's a certification that goes with that. So again, look for those clauses. Look for those clauses in your contract and understand what your certification requirements are. And at that, Mandy, I'm all wrapped here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Louis. That was a great presentation, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
And also thank you to everyone who joined us today. The recording is going to be on our website and our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS.
All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again for the opportunity.